They would later say the first sound was her voice, not the wind, not the horses, not the loose shutter knocking against the side of the old lined shack, but a woman's voice, low and tight with pain, saying, "You're hurting me," as if the dark itself had put those words in her mouth and sent them out across the mesa. The man kneeling in front of her did not flinch when she said it. He did not look away either. Firelight moved once across the hard line of his jaw, across the tired dust on his coat, across the hands that had spent too many years doing rough work in rough country. Then he answered in a voice so quiet it nearly disappeared beneath the wind. "I don't know any softer way." Outside, the night lay over Arizona like a black wool blanket pulled tight across the earth. The moon was thin as a shaving of bone, and the desert beyond the shack looked empty enough to fool a fool. But Jonah Reed had lived too long under open sky to trust empty land. He knew what waited in stillness. He knew how trouble could sit just past the reach of a lantern, listening. The horses tied behind the shack had gone uneasy 10 minutes earlier, shifting their weight, blowing through their noses, catching a scent the man could not yet name. Still, he kept his eyes on the woman in front of him. Ayanna sat with her back against the cedar plank wall, one hand braced hard on the floorboards, the other gripping the edge of a wool blanket Jonah had folded beneath her shoulders. Her breathing came shallow and fast, though she fought to hide it. Pride was in the set of her mouth, in the lift of her chin, in the furious steadiness with which she stared at him, as if refusing him the comfort of seeing fear there. She was Apache, and even in pain she carried herself like a person who had never once in her life asked the world for mercy. That, more than anything, was why Jonah took care with her. Not gentle care. There was no room for that now. Just honest care. The kind that asks nothing, explains little, and stays until the hard part is over. The lamp on the crate beside them gave off a weak yellow light, and the smell of hot metal. Nearby, a coffee pot sat forgotten on the little stove, burned down to bitterness. The whole shack carried the scent of old pine, saddle soap, dust, and rain that had passed this country 3 days ago and touched almost nothing. But under it all was another smell now, sharper, heavier, the smell of trouble already done. Jonah had noticed at the moment he found her slumped near the dry wash less than a mile south of the ridge. At first he thought she was dead. Then he saw her eyelids tremble. Then she opened her eyes and tried to reach for the knife at her belt. Even half-conscious, she had tried to fight him. He respected that. He respected it more because she still looked ready to try again. "Hold still," he said. She gave him a look cold enough to frost glass. "You say that like it's easy." "No," Jonah said. "I say it because it's necessary." A faint line formed between her brows. Not softness, not trust, just the smallest pause, as if she had expected a different sort of man and was bothered to find she might have guessed wrong. Jonah had seen that look before, years back, in camps, in towns, in courtrooms, in places where people decided what another soul must be before they had heard 10 words from them. Out here, a white man and an Apache woman alone in a shack after midnight looked like one kind of story to anyone outside. The truth had never cared much for appearances, and the desert cared even less. He reached for the clean strip of cloth warming beside the lantern and wrapped it once around his hand before touching her shoulder again. This time he moved slower. She sucked in a breath through her teeth and turned her face toward the wall, but she did not pull away. That mattered. In this country, trust was often nothing more than a person deciding not to run while they still could. "Why did you come back?" she asked after a long moment. Her voice was weaker now, but the edge in it had not gone anywhere. "Could have left me where I fell." Jonah leaned back on his heels. For a second, he listened to the boards creak and the far-off cry of some night bird over the flats. "I could have," he said, "but I didn't." The answer seemed to trouble her more than if he had given a noble one. She studied him in the lamp glow, taking in the old cavalry coat he wore because it was warm, not because he honored what it once meant, the plain wedding band hanging on a leather cord around his neck instead of resting on his hand, the scar near his temple, the tiredness that seemed built into his face deeper than sun or age. Jonah saw her notice all of it. He also saw the instant she became aware of the satchel tucked beside her blanket. Small, weathered, tied shut with rawhide. Her eyes sharpened. Her hand moved a fraction toward it. Jonah noticed, but made no move to stop her. "I didn't touch it," he said. "It's yours." Ayanna looked at the satchel, then back at him, And something changed, not enough to be trust, not yet, but enough to let silence enter the room without turning ugly. Outside, one of the horses stamped hard. Then another. Jonah's head lifted. He heard it then, not wind, not wood, not the loose hitch chain tapping the post. Hoofbeats. More than one rider. Still some distance off, but coming steady through the dark. Ayanna heard them too. Her eyes found his, and for the first time that night, what passed between them was not anger, not pride, not suspicion. It was the cold understanding that whatever had followed her across the desert had finally found the door. Jonah moved before the second set of hoofbeats rolled over the flat. He pinched the lantern wick down until the light shrank to a weak amber eye, then crossed to the door and listened with one hand on the bar. The riders were still far enough out that the sound came broken by wind and distance, but there were at least 3 of them, maybe 4, and they were keeping a straight line from the south wash to the shack, as if they had something better than moonlight to guide them. Behind him, Ayanna pushed herself upright too fast and caught the wall for balance. The blanket slipped from one shoulder. Jonah turned at once, not because he had forgotten the riders, but because he could hear the strain in her breathing. "Do not stand up unless you plan to stay standing," he said. "You do not get to order me around in my own life." Her voice was thinner now, though the fire in it held. Jonah almost smiled at that. "Almost. No," he said, "but I do get to keep you from falling on my floor." He came back to her, crouched, and offered his hand without touching her. She stared at it the way a person studies a trap before deciding whether it is safer inside or out. Then she took his wrist, hard, as if making it clear she accepted help and not comfort, and let him steady her back down against the wall. Her hand was cool. Too cool. That bothered him more than the hoofbeats. He reached toward the stove, poured half a cup of water from the dented kettle, and passed it to her. She did not drink right away. She looked into the tin cup first, then at him, then at the cup again. Jonah saw the calculation in her face and did not take offense. Out here, caution kept more people alive than kindness did. "If I wanted you dead," he said, "I would have saved myself the trouble." That earned him the faintest shift at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile. Not yet. But something that remembered how one might begin. She drank, slow and careful, then lowered the cup. The riders sounded closer now. The horses outside had gone quiet in the way animals do when they stop asking questions and start listening for answers. Jonah reached for the old Winchester leaning beside the door, checked that it was loaded, and set it across the table within reach, more for honesty than threat. He had no wish to fire it. He had even less wish to explain why a wounded Apache woman was in his shack to men who arrived already believing a story. "Who are they?" he asked. Ayanna looked past him toward the wall, as if she could see through it into the night. "That depends," she said, "on whether the desert brought the wrong men or the worst men." Jonah let that settle. He had known enough people to understand when a question had been answered as far as it was going to be. He crouched again near the crate beside her and untied a cloth roll of simple tools, the sort a ranch hand might carry for fixing tack, pulling splinters, or doing other rough little jobs the land demanded. Ayanna watched his hands as he laid everything out in order. There was no panic in her now, only resistance held together by will. "You said it was necessary," she said after a moment. "Necessary for what?" Jonah glanced at her shoulder, then back at her face. "For keeping the fever from getting ahead of us by morning." She did not answer. The wind thudded once against the outer wall. Somewhere in the dark, leather creaked. Jonah could feel the whole night narrowing around the shack like a cinched strap, pulled one notch tighter at a time. "I have seen men die from less," he said, "and I have seen stubborn people live through worse. I have not yet decided which kind you are." "I have," she said. "Good," he replied. "Then save me the guessing." He folded a clean square of muslin, poured a little whiskey over it, and waited. Ayanna looked at the cloth, then at the satchel beside her leg. This time she dragged it close and held it against her ribs, as if the thing inside mattered as much as breath. Jonah noticed the gesture and filed it away without comment. Whatever she carried had weight beyond ounces. Some objects did. A ring, a letter, a folded photograph, a small bundle tied shut against the world. Men had started wars over papers no thicker than a church bulletin. He knew better than to underestimate what fit in a woman's hand. "You never asked my name," she said. Jonah paused. "No, why?" He set the bottle down. "Because names make people feel safer than they are." Her eyes narrowed. studying him again as if each answer he gave fit nowhere she had expected. "And what do you call yourself?" "Jonah Reed." She repeated it once under her breath, not warmly, not kindly, but with the careful attention of someone setting a thing on an inner shelf where it could be reached later. Then she lifted her chin. "Ayanna." Jonah nodded, as if he had been handed something valuable and had enough sense not to squeeze it too tight. "All right," he said softly. "Ayanna, I need you to stay still for 1 minute. That is not a small thing to ask." "I know." He moved with as much care as the moment allowed, changing the bandage, cleaning what he could, working fast but not hurried, his hands steady from old practice he never talked about. She went rigid once, then breathed through it, refusing even now to give the room more sound than necessary. Jonah respected her more with every second. Outside, the hoofbeats reached the yard at last. One horse snorted, another pawed dirt. Then came the scrape of a boot hitting the ground, followed by a man's voice from the dark, low and certain. "Light is still on in there," the voice said. "I told you he did not go far." Jonah and Ayanna looked at each other in the dim shack, and in that one silent moment both of them understood the same hard truth. The men outside had not come by chance. They had come for something specific, and whatever Ayanna had carried across 10 miles of desert was worth arriving after midnight to claim. Ayanna moved before Jonah could stop her. One hand closed around the satchel at her side. The other found the edge of the crate and pushed until she was sitting straighter, breath thin but controlled, eyes fixed on the door as if she could will the rough pine boards to turn clear. Jonah saw the effort it cost her. He also saw that arguing would waste seconds they did not have. Outside, a spur rang once against a boot heel. Then came another voice, sharper than the first. "He is in there. I saw his horse at the wash." Jonah stepped between the door and the woman without thinking about it. It was the kind of motion a man made when he had spent too much of his life putting himself in the narrow space where trouble had to pass first. He kept one hand low near the Winchester on the table, but did not raise it. A gun in sight changed the shape of a conversation before a word was spoken, and he was not yet ready to tell the night what kind of story this was going to be. Ayanna watched him with a hard, searching stillness. "You should let them take me," she said. Jonah did not turn around. "That sounds like a lie. It sounds like sense." "No," he said, listening to boots move in the dirt outside. "It sounds like something a person says when she knows exactly what waits for her out there." The silence behind him lasted half a breath too long. Then Ayanna said, quieter now, "You do not know anything about what waits for me." Jonah kept his eyes on the door latch. The wood had swelled from old storms and never fit clean in the frame. The whole shack was that way, tired, weathered, still standing for reasons nobody could fully explain. "I know men who ride after midnight do not come because they are patient," he said. "And I know a woman does not cross 10 miles of bad country half-conscious unless what is behind her is worse than what is ahead." He heard her breathing change again. Not pain this time. Thought. Outside, knuckles struck the door 3 times, not loud, not polite, but with the kind of control that meant the man on the other side believed he had time to choose his tone. "Mister," the first voice called, "we are looking for stolen property and an Indian woman. Open up, and this can stay easy." Jonah finally turned his head enough to look back at Ayanna. Firelight touched the sharp line of her cheekbone, the loose braid over her shoulder, the strain around her eyes. She looked angry at the world, angry at him, and angriest of all at whatever weakness had forced her under his roof. Even so, when she met his gaze, there was no fear in it. There was calculation, pride, a warning. "Do not believe them," she said. Jonah gave the smallest nod. "I did not plan to." A strange thing passed through her expression then, there and gone in a blink, as if she had expected resistance from him, but not certainty. Jonah opened the stove door, took out the folded paper packet he kept tucked beneath the coffee tin, and dropped it into the firebox without ceremony. Ranch records, feed costs, a bill of sale for 2 mares. Nothing important enough to die for, but enough to be useful to a man who preferred not to leave pieces of his life lying around for strangers to study. Then he crossed to the basin, splashed water over his hands, and wiped them on a clean towel as if he had all the time in the territory. "What is in the satchel?" he asked. Ayanna's grip tightened at once. "Mine." "That was not my question." "Then ask a better one." Jonah almost laughed, but the sound never quite made it out. Outside, the same man struck the door again, harder now. The horses shifted. Leather creaked. Somebody muttered something about breaking the bar. Jonah set the towel down. "If I open that door blind," he said, "I make choices with half the deck missing. So I will ask it straight. Are those men after you because of who you are, or because of what you carry?" Ayanna held his gaze a long moment. He could see the fight inside her, not over whether to trust him, but over whether necessity had already made the decision. At last she glanced down at the satchel. "Both," she said. That answer landed in the room like a dropped stone. Jonah felt the weight of it settle into place with all the other pieces he had been turning over since he found her by the wash. The distance she had covered while fading fast, the way she checked the bag before she checked her own bandage, the fact that men were willing to ride in darkness to reach her first. Not robbery, then. Not chance. Something cleaner and uglier than either. "Is there paper in there?" he asked. Ayanna did not answer at first. Then she said, "There is truth in there." Outside, the latch jerked once under a testing hand. "Last chance, friend," the voice called. "We know she is with you." Jonah looked at the door, then at the woman, and in that instant he understood what troubled him most. It was not the men outside. Men outside could be counted. It was the look in Ayanna's eyes when she said the word truth. He had seen that look only a few times in his life, and every time it belonged to someone carrying a thing the world would rather bury. He reached for the Winchester at last, not dramatically, just with the weary steadiness of a man accepting the next mile, because the trail had already chosen itself. "Can you stand if I need you to?" he asked. Ayanna shifted, set her jaw, and gave one short nod. It was not convincing. It was enough. Jonah moved to the door and lifted the bar free without opening it. Then he spoke through the wood in a voice flat as dry ground. "You men came a long way to knock on another man's door after midnight. So here's how this works. You tell me your names first, and then maybe I decide whether I know you well enough to let you lie to my face." For 2 full seconds the night gave him nothing. Then a different voice answered from the yard, smoother than the others, the kind of voice that wore good manners like a borrowed coat. "Wade Cutter," it said. "And if you open up, I can explain why the woman in there does not belong to you." At that, Jonah felt Ayanna go still behind him. So still it was like the whole shack had stopped breathing with her. Jonah did not answer right away. His hand stayed on the door bar, his eyes on the dark seam where the planks met the frame, while Wade Cutter's last words hung in the shack like wood smoke that refused to clear. Ayanna had gone so still behind him that he could feel her silence more than hear her breathing. That told him more than fear would have. A name can be a lie. A voice can be practiced. But stillness like that only comes when the truth has just walked into the yard and called itself by name. Outside, one of the other men shifted in the dirt and said, "Let us finish this, Wade." Cutter did not raise his voice. No need to make a scene. Jonah almost smiled at that. Men who said there was no need to make a scene were usually the very kind who had arrived to make one. He spoke through the door without moving closer. "You sound mighty sure of what is in my house for a man standing in the dark." "I make it my business to be sure," Cutter said. "Then you will not mind telling me why 3 riders need midnight to settle honest business." A pause followed. Not long. Just long enough to show that the question had landed where Jonah meant it to. Then Cutter answered, smooth as river stone. "Because daylight gives people time to run." Jonah let those words sit. Behind him, the fire in the little stove settled with a faint pop. The coffee pot lid rattled. Wind moved along the side of the shack in a dry whisper, carrying dust through the gaps in the boards and the faint smell of horse sweat. From the yard, everything in the room felt smaller now. The crate by the wall, the narrow bunk with its army blanket, the chipped basin, the satchel in Ayanna's lap. Especially that satchel. Jonah had known from the start it mattered. Now he knew it mattered enough to pull riders across bad country after midnight. He turned at last and looked at her. "You know him?" It was not a question. Ayanna held his gaze a moment, then looked down at the leather ties around the satchel. Her fingers rested there lightly, but Jonah noticed how carefully, almost reverently, as if the thing inside was less an object than a burden she had agreed to carry. "I know his kind," she said. "That is not the same thing. Tonight it might be." Another knock came, harder this time. Cutter had run out of patience or decided to perform impatience for the men with him. "Mr. Reed," he called, using Jonah's name as if they had met over coffee instead of through a locked door at midnight. The woman in there stole from the army courier line and fled south. She is injured, desperate, and not in her right mind. I would hate for you to get tangled in somebody else's crime. Jonah stared at the door, then let his eyes drift to the dust on the floorboards. There were 2 sets of prints in the shack. His own, wide and worn at the heel. Ayana's, lighter, dragging a little near the stove where she had nearly fallen. He had lived long enough to know that lies often arrive dressed in the language of reason. Ayana gave a low sound that might have been disgust or pain. Army courier line, she said. He says that as if it belongs to him. Jonah crossed back to her and crouched again, keeping his voice low. Start where you can. Leave out what you must. But if I am going to keep that door closed, I need more than half of the ground under me. Ayana did not answer at once. Her eyes moved over his face as though she were measuring not his strength, but his limits. Whether he was the kind of man who wanted truth only until it became expensive. Whether he would still hold the line when the cost rose. At last she loosened one of the leather ties and opened the satchel just enough for him to see the corner of folded paper sealed in red wax. Thick and official, the sort of paper that traveled with escorts and disappeared into drawers men kept locked. Beside it lay something else, smaller, wrapped in a square of faded cloth. A letter, Jonah said. And more than a letter, Ayana replied. She drew a breath that caught halfway, then forced it steady. The messenger who carried it was dying when I found him. He had fallen near Black Rock Creek. His horse was gone. His canteen was gone. His hands were empty except for this. She looked down at the satchel. He did not ask my tribe. He did not ask my name. He only said, do not let Wade Cutter reach Fort Lowell before the truth does. Jonah felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the night air. What truth? Ayana's jaw tightened. That children were sold. That routes were given away. That men were paid to look in the other direction while families disappeared. Outside, one of the horses snorted and shook tack. The sound seemed very far away for a second. Jonah had heard rumors over the years, the sort that moved along cattle trails and through kitchen doors in half sentences. Always ugly, never proved. Gone by morning because most folks preferred a clean lie to a dirty fact. He looked again at the wax seal. Army business, maybe, maybe not. But the weight in Ayana's voice when she said children was not the weight of rumor. It was the weight of memory. And the other thing in there? He asked softly. Her hand hovered over the cloth bundle. Proof that the letter is real. She did not unwrap it. She did not need to. Jonah could see that whatever lay inside mattered enough that even now she was not ready to expose it to lamplight unless there was no other choice. He respected that. Some truths needed their own timing. Why bring it here? He asked. Ayana gave a faint, tired laugh with no humor in it. I did not choose here. I chose east. Then I chose standing. Then I chose 1 more mile. After that, your shack chose me. Jonah glanced toward the door again. Cutter had gone quiet. That worried him more than the knocking had. Quiet men, outside a closed door, were usually arranging the next move. Does Cutter know what is in the satchel? Jonah asked. He knows enough to hunt it. And the men with him? They know what he told them. Which is? Ayana lifted her eyes to his. Firelight made them look darker, deeper, old as the hills beyond the wall. That I am a thief. That I ran with something not meant for my hands. That no one will question a white man riding at night to take back what belongs to the government. Jonah breathed out slowly. There it was. Not just greed. Not just power. Certainty. The hard, lazy certainty that the world would believe his kind of face before it believed hers. He had seen that certainty all his life, sometimes in uniform, sometimes behind a desk, sometimes seated at the front of a church. It never changed its smell. Outside, Cutter spoke again, calm as ever. Reed, I am giving you a final chance to stay clear of this. Open the door. Hand over the satchel. Keep your ranch, your horse, and your peace. Jonah stood up. The floorboard under his boot gave a tired groan. He picked up the Winchester from the table, not lifting the barrel high, only holding it the way a man held a fence post in a storm, because something steady was needed. Then he looked at Ayana, at the worn blanket around her shoulders, at the strain she hid, at the satchel she guarded like a heartbeat. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. You were wrong about one thing. Her brow furrowed. What thing? Jonah turned back toward the door. This stopped being your trouble the moment they decided I would be easier to fool than you. Jonah spoke through the door without raising his voice. You rode onto my ground after midnight, and now you are offering me peace like it is yours to hand out. That tells me everything I need to know. For the first time since the riders arrived, the yard went completely still. No spur chime, no saddle creak, no muttered answer from the men behind Wade Cutter. Just the thin, dry wind brushing the wall and the far-off cry of something hunting out on the flats. Jonah had learned long ago that silence could carry more threat than shouting ever did. It was in silence that men chose what mask to wear next. Behind him, Ayanna shifted against the wall and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He could hear the strain in that small movement. She was holding herself together by will alone now, and will had limits even in the strongest people. Jonah did not look back, but he was aware of her the way a man is aware of the only candle left burning in a dark church. You are making a mistake, Cutter said at last. The smoothness was still there, but something under it had gone harder. You do not even know what side you are taking. Jonah rested the heel of the Winchester against the floorboards. Maybe I know enough about yours. Ayanna let out a breath that might have been a bitter laugh. The sound was soft, but it reached the door all the same. Outside, one of the other riders said, "There. You hear her? She is hurt." Cutter answered before Jonah could. Exactly why this should end quickly. Jonah did turn then, just enough to look at Ayanna. Firelight trembled across her face. Sweat shone at her temples. Her mouth had gone pale with effort, but her eyes were clear, fixed on him, not pleading, not asking. Waiting. It struck Jonah then how strange the night had become. 3 hours earlier, she would have reached for a knife before trusting his hand. Now she was trusting him with something larger than her life. Not with hope. Hope was too soft a word. With the right to decide whether the truth she carried would live to see daylight. He did not take that lightly. "Sit back," he told her. "Save your strength." "I am tired of men saying that to me," she replied. "Tonight you might let one of them be right." That almost drew a real smile from her. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Another voice rose from outside, younger than Cutter's, impatient and uncertain. "Wade, somebody could have heard us by now." Jonah heard that and filed it away. Men worried about being heard only when what they were doing needed darkness to cover it. Cutter answered sharply enough to quiet the younger man, then knocked once more, controlled but no longer friendly. "Reed, listen carefully. There is a widow named Mrs. Porter, 2 miles north of here. She saw you bring the Apache woman inside. If this turns sour, her word will reach town before sunrise. You know how that will sound." The words hung in the shack with a different kind of weight. Jonah felt Ayanna go still again. Not because she did not understand. Because she understood perfectly. A witness. A town. A story already half written by the wrong eyes. Jonah had met Mrs. Porter once at a church supper in Mesilla. She was decent enough, kind even, but decency did not save people from believing what fit easiest. A white ranch hand carrying a wounded Apache woman into an empty shack after dark. Most folks would not wait for truth to put on its boots. They would run with the first ugly version and call it common sense. Jonah set the rifle against the table and stepped to the small window beside the stove. The cloth he used as a curtain had already been pulled aside. Through the glass, silvered by moonlight and dust, he could just make out shapes in the yard. 3 mounted men. 1 dismounted, standing near the hitch post in a hat with too much confidence in its tilt. Wade Cutter, most likely. Broad shoulders. Good coat. The kind of man who dressed clean because he expected other people to do his dirty work. Beyond him the desert opened into dim ridges and shallow scrub, all washed in gray. No town lights. No help. Just miles of listening earth. "He is lying about one thing," Ayanna said quietly. Jonah kept his gaze on the yard. "Only one. Mrs. Porter did see you carry me in. But she did not stay. She was afraid." Jonah nodded once. Fear moved faster than truth in every county he had ever known. "Then by dawn," he said, "Mesilla may already have a story to tell about us." "About me?" Ayanna corrected. "No," Jonah said, turning from the window. "About whatever people already wanted to believe." That landed between them and stayed there. Ayanna lowered her eyes to the satchel in her lap. Her fingers brushed the worn leather, then the knot at the flap, as if touching it reminded her what mattered when everything else blurred. "If they reach town first," she said, "they will say I stole government papers. They will say I lured a white rancher into helping me. They will say anything that makes their own hunger look lawful. Jonah sat on the edge of the table, close enough to be heard, far enough not to crowd her. Then we make sure they do not reach town first. She studied him. There are 3 of them. That I can see. And I cannot ride fast. I noticed. And you still talk like there is a path through this. Jonah looked toward the stove, where the fire had settled into a red bed of coals. There is always a path, he said. Sometimes it just costs more than a man hoped to pay. Outside, Cutter called again, a little louder now, for the benefit of the others as much as Jonah. You are protecting a thief, Reed. Think about how that looks when the sheriff hears it. Jonah let the words pass through him like wind through fence wire. Sheriff. Town. Witness. Reputation. He knew the shape Cutter was building. Not a raid. Not yet. Something meaner. Respectable pressure. The kind that let a man ruin you with clean hands and a straight collar. That was when Jonah understood the next piece. Cutter did not want to break down the door. He wanted Jonah to open it himself and step willingly into the lie. He needs me to surrender her, Jonah said. Ayanna lifted her head. Why? Because if he takes the satchel by force, he is only another rider in the dark. But if I hand it over, then tomorrow he becomes the reasonable man, and I become the fool who corrected his mistake. Ayanna looked at him for a long second, and for the first time since he found her at the wash, something in her face gave way. Not weakness. Recognition. As if she had spent her whole life watching white men choose the easier lie, and had just now realized this one could see the machinery of it turning. Outside, a horse tossed its head. Then, from farther off than the yard, faint but clear in the dry night air, came another sound. Hooves again. Not 3. More. Jonah turned toward the window at once. Cutter heard it too. Who was that? One of his men called. No one answered. Jonah stepped to the glass and peered into the moon-blanched dark beyond the ridge line. At first he saw nothing. Then a string of moving shadows broke loose from the land itself, low and silent and coming fast. Ayanna rose halfway before pain caught her, and even then her eyes never left the window. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. They found me first. The riders coming over the ridge did not sound like town men. Town men rode with noise when they had numbers. They wanted the world to know they were arriving. These riders came in with the hush of people who had learned long ago that the desert gave more to those who did not argue with it. Jonah counted shadows first, then stopped counting. Too many for comfort. Enough to change the shape of the night. In the yard, Wade Cutter's men shifted at once. Their horses sensed it before they did, ears cutting forward, bodies tightening under saddle. Cutter stepped away from the hitch post and looked toward the ridge, his confidence thinning by degrees. Who did you bring here? He called toward the shack, but the question was not really for Jonah. It was fear putting on a voice. Inside, Ayanna stood with one hand pressed to the wall, the blanket fallen loose at her elbows, her face pale from effort and firelight, but her eyes clearer than Jonah had yet seen them. Not men who ride for Wade Cutter, she said. Jonah looked at her, then back to the window. The line of approaching horsemen spread as they came, not in a rush, not wild, but deliberate, holding the ground as if they belonged to it more than the moon did. The lead rider lifted one hand, and the men behind him eased their pace without a word. That silence said more than a shouted threat ever could. Your people, Jonah said. Ayanna gave the smallest nod. Relief did not soften her face. It only made her seem suddenly more tired. If they see me standing in here with you and Cutter in the yard, they will not know which lie to shoot first. Jonah took that in. She was right. Nights like this turned simple truths into tangled rope. A wounded Apache woman in a white rancher's shack, armed men outside, a satchel full of something worth hunting, and now more riders cresting the ridge before dawn. It would take very little for everyone to decide they already understood enough. Cutter called again, louder now, no longer pretending it manners. Reed, open this door and explain yourself. Jonah let that sit unanswered. He turned to Ayanna instead. Can you walk 3 steps without falling? She looked offended by the question, which he took as a good sign. I can walk farther than that. I only need 3 right now. He crossed to her, stopped an arm's length away, and held out his hand once more without touching her. She looked at it, then at him. The first time she had taken his wrist like a challenge. This time she placed her hand in his palm because balance was balance and the floor was not getting steadier for either of them. Her fingers were still cool, but not as cold as before. Jonah helped her move from the wall to the side of the table, where she could stand if she locked her knees and leaned a little. He did not keep hold of her longer than needed. That, too, she noticed. Outside, the new riders entered the yard fully now. Moonlight struck beadwork, dark braids, rifle barrels, horse tack worn smooth by use, and faces cut from the same hard patience as the land. At their front rode an older man wrapped in a dark blanket coat, straight-backed, his gaze moving once over the shack, once over Cutter, and then settling on the door as though it could not keep truth from him for long. Cutter took off his hat, the gesture too fast to be respect and too careful to be casual. "Chief Dakota," he said, "this is fortunate. We are recovering stolen government property from a fugitive." Ayanna closed her eyes for half a second at the word fortunate, as if she had heard enough white men describe other people's misery as luck for one lifetime. Jonah stepped to the door and drew a slow breath. When he lifted the bar this time, he opened the door only wide enough to stand in the space himself. Cold desert air slid in at once, carrying dust, horse leather, and the metallic scent of a night about to turn. Cutter stood 10 feet off, hat in hand now, his expression arranged into concern. Behind him, the other two riders sat stiff in their saddles, their confidence blown thinner by the arrival of men they could not order around. Beyond them, Chief Dakota remained mounted, still as carved stone, with a half-circle of Apache riders spread behind him. No one raised a weapon. No one needed to. The yard felt held between heartbeats. "You are Jonah Reed," Cutter said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You took in a wounded woman who fled with stolen papers. I appreciate your cooperation from here on." Jonah leaned one shoulder against the doorframe as if all he had in front of him was a weather question. "I do not remember offering any." Cutter's jaw set for a fraction of a second, then smoothed again. "This does not concern you. It became my concern when you rode onto my land and started naming what was in my house." Jonah could feel every eye in the yard move between them. Chief Dakota had not said a word. That silence weighed more than Cutter's speech ever would. "Then let us be plain," Cutter said. "The woman inside is under suspicion for taking government correspondence meant for Fort Lowell. She is also injured, which makes her dangerous to herself and others. Hand her over, and no blame falls on you." Jonah glanced past Cutter toward the chief and the riders behind him. None of them moved. None of them blinked much either. Men who had lived through enough grief rarely wasted motion. He thought then of Ayanna gripping the satchel against her ribs, of the sealed letter, of the way she said children as if the word itself had teeth. He thought of Mrs. Porter, of Messiah, of how easy it would be by breakfast for a clean lie to sit in every mouth in town. Then he looked back at Cutter. "You talk about blame the way some men talk about weather," Jonah said. "Like it only lands where you say." Cutter's smile lost the last of its warmth. "And you talk like you understand more than you do." Before Jonah could answer, a voice came from inside the shack. Thin from exhaustion, steady from something deeper. "He understands enough." Every head in the yard turned toward the doorway then. Ayanna stepped into view, one hand braced against the jamb, the blanket around her shoulders, the satchel held close at her side. She was not strong enough for the walk, and the night knew it. But there she stood anyway, small against the dark, pale with strain, proud as a flag that has been through weather and still refuses to lower. Chief Dakota's face changed almost too little to see. Relief, fear, anger, gratitude, all of it banked down into something private and stern. Cutter, on the other hand, went still in the wrong way. Not like a careful man, like a man who had just watched a buried thing rise to the surface alive. Ayanna lifted her chin and looked first at the chief, then at Cutter, and finally at Jonah, just once, long enough for him to understand that whatever came next had already chosen its ground. "I did not steal the truth," she said. "I carried it." For a few seconds after Ayanna spoke, nobody in the yard seemed willing to breathe first. The horses stood with their heads high and their ears forward. Moonlight rested on saddle leather, rifle stocks, and the pale dust lying over everything like a second skin. Jonah could feel the desert watching, the way it always did when men tried to bend truth into something smaller than it was. Ayanna stayed in the doorway with one hand against the frame, the satchel held close, her face drawn from strain, but her voice still carrying the kind of steadiness that does not come from strength alone. It comes from having already decided what matters more than comfort. Chief Takota looked at her a long time before he said anything. His eyes moved once over the blanket on her shoulders, once over the tired line of her stance, once over Jonah standing beside her, and then to Wade Cutter. Nothing in the chief's face rose high enough to be called anger, but the air around him changed all the same. It went colder. Cutter felt it too. Jonah saw the man straighten a little, as though posture might do the work character could not. She is confused, Cutter said quickly, smiling for the chief now instead of for Jonah. She has been injured, and Mr. Reed here admits he found her alone in the wash. She is frightened. She does not understand what she is carrying. I understand enough, Ayana said. Her voice was not loud, but it landed clean. Cutter turned slightly toward her, and for the first time since he rode up, some of the polish slipped from him. You understand what you were told by a dying courier in the dirt. That is not the same thing as understanding the law. Jonah heard the word law and nearly laughed. Men like Cutter loved that word the way gamblers loved loaded dice. They called upon it only when they had already arranged the table. Chief Takota finally spoke, and when he did, the yard seemed to lean toward him. My daughter crossed 30 miles of hard land to keep that satchel from you, he said. That tells me enough to listen before I judge. Cutter opened his hands, all reason and patience. Then listen to this. Government correspondence was stolen. My duty is to recover it before it causes trouble between the fort and your people. Surely none of us wants that. One of the Apache riders behind the chief shifted at those words. Not much, just enough for Jonah to notice the quiet offense in the movement. Your people. As if Cutter were speaking to weather, not men. Ayana's eyes flashed. You speak of trouble as if you did not carry it here yourself. Careful, Cutter said, and the softness in his tone made the word uglier than a shout would have. Jonah took one step farther into the doorway, not enough to challenge, just enough to remind every man in the yard that the shack was still his threshold. She has been careful all night, he said. Maybe it is your turn. Cutter looked at him, then with open dislike for the first time. This is larger than your ranch, Reed. Funny, Jonah replied. It rode straight onto it anyway. The younger man behind Cutter muttered something under his breath, and one of the Apache riders answered him with a look so flat it shut him up without a word needing to be spoken. Jonah felt the balance of the yard shifting now, not toward peace, not yet, but away from the easy lie Cutter had expected to manage. That made the man more dangerous, not less. Men who lost control in front of witnesses often reached for the nearest cruelty just to prove they still could. Chief Takeda extended one hand toward Ayana, palm up, not ordering, only asking. Come here, he said. Ayana tried to step down from the threshold and nearly folded with the effort. Jonah moved before thought had time to catch him. He put a steadying hand beneath her elbow. Nothing more, just enough to keep the ground from rising too fast. She stiffened for a breath out of habit, then let the support remain. The motion was small, but in that yard it might as well have been shouted. Cutter saw it. So did the chief. So did every rider there. Ayana lifted her chin, embarrassed more by weakness than by witness, and Jonah took his hand away the moment she found her balance. Chief Takota watched that too, and something in his gaze changed, not into warmth, but into a tension of a different kind. He was no longer looking at Jonah as a white man beside his daughter. He was looking at him as a man whose hands had stopped where they should. Show me what you carry, the chief said. Ayana held the satchel tighter for one heartbeat, then nodded. She untied the flap with careful fingers and drew out the folded paper sealed in red wax. Even in moonlight, Jonah could see the seal catch Cutter's eye like a spark landing in dry grass. There it was. Not greed alone. Fear. Real fear, quick and bright and badly hidden. That letter was not meant for her, Cutter said. No, Ayana answered. It was meant to arrive somewhere you could not stop it. She reached into the satchel again, and this time brought out the smaller bundle wrapped in faded cloth. For a second, she only held it. The yard seemed to narrow around that little square of fabric. Jonah could hear leather settling, a horse blowing softly, the lonely clink of a bit chain. Then Ayana unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a silver badge, dusty but unmistakable, and beneath it a signet ring with a dark blue stone. Cutter's face did not collapse. Men like him practiced too much for that. But it changed enough. The color left it. The smile never came back. The courier gave me these, Ayana said. He said if the letter was denied, these would tell the rest. The badge belongs to Deputy Marshal Owen Pike. The ring belongs to Captain Ellis Harrow from Fort Lowell. Chief Takada's eyes went from the badge to Cutter with a stillness that felt older than anger. Jonah had heard both names before. Pike had a reputation for clean work. Harrow had one for clean gloves. Seeing their tokens together in the same cloth bundle at midnight in a ranch yard did not make for innocent explanations. Cutter found his voice first. "Stolen," he said. "Or planted." "By whom?" Jonah asked quietly. Cutter snapped his eyes toward him. Jonah went on before the man could answer. "A wounded woman alone in the desert? Or the courier who died protecting them? You are running short on believable people, Wade." Nobody moved after that. They did not need to. The truth had not fully arrived yet, but its horse was already in the yard. Wade Cutter did not reach for the badge or the ring. A smarter man might have tried. A duller one might have shown panic. Cutter did neither. He stood in the moonlight with his hat in one hand and his other hand loose at his side, letting the silence do what he hoped his face no longer could. Jonah watched him carefully then, because this was the part where certain men became most dangerous. Not when they were winning. When they realized the room had turned and they had not been invited with it. Chief Takada remained mounted, his blanket coat stirring once in the wind, his eyes on the letter in Ayana's hand. "Open it," he said. He did not say please. He did not say now. He did not need to. Ayana looked down at the red wax seal, and Jonah saw something pass through her expression that had nothing to do with fear. Weariness, maybe. The kind that comes when carrying truth begins to feel heavier than the lie chasing it. Her fingers hesitated only a moment before she broke the seal. The sound was small, almost nothing, but in that yard it carried. She unfolded the paper with care, as if the page might tear under the weight of what it held. Cutter shifted then. Barely. A single change in stance. But Jonah saw it. So did the chief. "Read it," Cutter said, and the edge in his voice gave him away more than if he had shouted. "If it is real, then let us all hear it." "That is exactly what troubles you," Ayana said. She lifted the letter, but when she began, her voice wavered from exhaustion. Jonah stepped closer without crowding her. "Give it here," he said quietly. Her eyes went to his face at once. The yard waited. Every man in it seemed to understand that whatever happened next would not stay on this ranch. It would ride to the fort, to Mesilla, to every kitchen and stable and trading post between. Ayana looked at the paper, then at Jonah again, judging not whether he could read, but whether he could be trusted to carry her words without stealing them. At last she placed the letter in his hand. The paper felt heavier than paper should. Jonah unfolded it fully and held it near the lantern glow spilling through the doorway. The handwriting was tight and hurried, the sort of man used when time had started leaning on his shoulder. He read the first lines to himself, and the night around him seemed to narrow. Then he read aloud. "To any officer, magistrate, or witness with enough conscience left to act. I, Thomas Bell, courier in contract service to the Southern Line, testify that Captain Ellis Harrow accepted payment through Wade Cutter for route schedules involving Apache families under relocation watch and for the temporary removal of escort protection from marked wagons carrying children." No one in the yard moved. Jonah could hear the letter in his own hands. The dry desert air. The horses breathing. That was all. He kept reading. Deputy Marshal Owen Pike discovered the exchange and took possession of Harrow's ring and his own badge as evidence before riding to intercept the next transfer. Pike was not expected by Cutter's men. I believe he was followed and taken off the road near Black Rock Creek. If this reaches you, know that the payments were made in silver through Cutter and hidden under claims of supply and transport loss. I send this ahead because I do not expect to live to deliver it myself. Jonah lowered the page for 1 second and looked at Cutter. The man's face had gone very still, but not empty. Busy, calculating, measuring which lie might still fit through the space left to him. Jonah read the final lines. "The child ledger is not with this letter. Cutter keeps names in his head and numbers in a red account book stored apart from the fort records. If the Apache woman carrying this survives, believe her. She refused payment, water, and safe passage to bring this onward. That is how I know she is the only honest courier left in this country." When Jonah finished, the words seemed to remain in the air after his voice was gone, as though the night itself had memorized them. Ayana swayed where she stood. Jonah reached out on instinct, and this time she did not fight the hand at her elbow. Chief Takota dismounted slowly, the leather of his saddle giving one low creak. He took 3 steps forward and stopped. Moonlight found the hard lines in his face, the age there, the miles, the things no father should ever have to imagine and had imagined anyway. Children, he said at last, looking not at Cutter but at the ground between them. The word came out heavy enough to bend the whole yard beneath it. Cutter lifted his chin. You are hearing accusations from dead men and fugitives. Nothing more. There is no red book. There are no children. There is only a stolen letter and a wounded woman used by men who wanted trouble between the fort and your tribe. It was a good lie. Clean. Formal. Built for daylight. But it had arrived too late. Ayana drew a breath and pulled away from Jonah, just enough to stand on her own. There were children, she said. 2 girls and 1 boy in the first wagon I saw at Dry Cedar Gap. One little girl wore 1 blue ribbon and 1 white because they did not match. The boy had a burn scar on his left wrist. The older girl never spoke above a whisper. If you want me to tell more, I can. Cutter looked at her then as if silence itself might stop her mouth. Jonah felt a cold anger settle into him, calm and sharp. He had seen enough men try to erase a person by calling her confused, savage, female, injured, or all 4 at once. It was always the same hunger in different coats. Chief Takota lifted his head. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. That made every man listen harder. I do not need more tonight, he said. I need only enough. He turned his gaze to Wade Cutter. And now I have it. Cutter looked around then, perhaps for the first time understanding the full shape of the ground beneath him. His own men sat uncertain in their saddles. The Apache riders were no longer simply riders in the dark. They were witnesses. Jonah stood in the doorway holding the letter. Ayana stood beside him, exhausted but unbroken. The chief stood between 2 worlds and had not blinked away from either one. The lie had no easy road left. Still, Cutter made one last attempt, and perhaps that told Jonah more about the man than anything else had. He forced a smile too worn to pass for sincere. Read, he said. You have no reason to tie your future to this. Hand over the letter. Let the fort sort its own business. You are a rancher. Stay one. Jonah folded the paper once, carefully, and gave Cutter a look as plain as winter fence wire. I was a rancher yesterday, he said. Tonight, I am the man who heard it read. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came slowly over the Arizona flats, pale and thin at first, touching the ridge tops with a cold silver light before it ever found the yard. By then no one had moved much. Men who had ridden in with certainty now sat in silence, and the silence itself had changed sides. Wade Cutter seemed to understand that before anyone else did. Jonah saw it in the way the man's shoulders settled, not in surrender, not in remorse, but in the dull recognition that the road he had counted on was gone. Ayana stood beside the doorway with the blanket around her shoulders and the satchel empty now except for the little cloth bundle. She looked as though the night had taken nearly everything from her except the one thing it had failed to take in the first place. Her dignity. Jonah kept the letter in one hand, folded once, careful and dry. He had handled cattle contracts, land maps, seed invoices, and 1 old marriage license in his life, but never a sheet of paper that felt so much like a living thing. Chief Takota stepped forward until the first wash of dawn reached the toes of his boots. He did not speak to Cutter right away. He looked first at his daughter, and in that look there was more than relief. There was pain for the road she had crossed, anger for what had chased her, and the quiet, fierce pride of a father who had just learned the world had asked his child to carry something heavier than any child should. Come here, he said. Ayana took 1 step, then another. Jonah's hand lifted by instinct, ready if the ground betrayed her, but she kept her feet. When she reached the chief, he did not embrace her in some grand display for the yard. He only laid 1 hand against the side of her head for a brief moment, thumb resting near her temple as if making sure she was real. Then his hand dropped. That was all. Yet every rider there saw it. Every rider understood. Chief Takota turned then to Jonah. For a second the whole yard seemed to pause again. White rancher in a doorway. Apache chief in the dawn. A woman between them who had outlasted every lie aimed at her. Jonah did not know what the chief meant to say, if anything. Men like Takota did not waste words on what actions had already made plain. At last the older man spoke. She reached your door alive, he said. She left your door hurt. Jonah had no answer ready for that. So he gave the only honest one he had. She did most of the hard part herself. Ayana glanced at him then, and there was tiredness in her face, and pain, and something gentler than either that had not been there in the night. No, she said softly. The hard part was finding a man who would not hand me over just to keep his own life simple. Wade Cutter let out a breath that sounded almost like impatience, though it came too late to matter. If you are all finished trading noble lines, he said, the fort will want that letter, and the law will want proper custody of the evidence. Jonah looked at him. The first light of day had not been kind to Wade Cutter. Some men look stronger in daylight. Others only look more exact. Cutter belonged to the second kind. The careful coat, the polished boots, the clean collar. All of it now seemed less like order and more like disguise. Chief Takota did not turn his head, but his voice sharpened enough to stop the yard from breathing easy. You have spoken of law since you arrived. But law that comes only when it serves one man is not law. It is hunger wearing a badge. Cutter's jaw tightened. One of his riders looked away. The younger one seemed to find sudden interest in his reins. Jonah had seen that too, over the years. Wrong had a way of shrinking once daylight forced men to sit beside it. You cannot prove any of this by sunrise, Cutter said. And by noon the fort can deny every word on that page. Maybe, Jonah replied. But they will have to deny it in front of more eyes now. He looked past Cutter toward the east, where the morning was growing stronger, the sky opening from iron gray into pale gold. Messiah would wake soon. So would the road to Fort Lowell. So would every man who thought his title, his skin, or his uniform had made him untouchable. The letter would ride. Not hidden, not buried, written in daylight. Chief Takota held out his hand toward Jonah, not for the letter itself, but as if asking whether the next step between them would be made together. Jonah looked at the folded page once, then placed it in the chief's palm. Take 2 riders you trust, he said. I will ride with you as far as the crossroads, then on to the magistrate in town. Mrs. Porter saw enough to start a bad story. I would rather she also see how it ends. That brought the faintest change to Takota's expression. Respect, perhaps, or simply agreement between men who had both spent the night watching lies grow teeth. Ayana looked from one to the other, and for the first time since Jonah had found her near the wash, some of the iron in her face loosened. Not much, just enough for the woman beneath the endurance to be seen. You would ride into town carrying this? She asked Jonah. After what they will say? Jonah gave a small shrug. People usually say something. Let them work for once. A sound moved through the Apache riders then. Not laughter exactly. Something quieter. Approval without ceremony. Cutter heard it, and with that he seemed to understand there was no neat recovery left for him. No polite arrangement. No private correction. The truth had stepped into open air, and even if powerful men tried to drag it back under cover, too many boots had already left tracks around it. Chief Takota spoke to 2 of his riders in Apache, and they moved at once, not toward Cutter, not with noise, only enough to make it plain that the man's freedom of movement now belonged to the morning, not to him. Cutter looked as though he might argue, then thought better of it. Perhaps he had finally remembered that the difference between control and collapse can be one more sentence spoken at the wrong time. The sun edged a little higher. Warmth had not yet reached the ground, but it was coming. Ayana swayed where she stood, and this time Jonah did not wait for permission. He stepped nearer, slow enough for her to refuse. She did not. He offered his arm, and after one brief look at his face, she took it. Not because she was helpless. Not because he had earned ownership over any part of her life. Only because after a night like that, trust did not need to look dramatic to be real. He guided her to the chair just inside the doorway, and once she had settled, he moved his hand away. Always that. Enough, and then away. Ayana watched him for a long second. Then she said, so quietly only he and perhaps the dawn could hear, you still do not know any softer way. Jonah looked out over the yard, over the men, over the dust, over a world that had nearly chosen the easier lie and failed by an inch. No, he said. But I stayed. She held his gaze, and something passed between them that did not need naming yet. Not romance dressed up for a song. Not rescue mistaken for debt. Just recognition. 2 people from worlds taught to mistrust each other, standing in the same morning because one had carried the truth and the other had refused to drop it. Outside, Chief Takota mounted again with the letter secured inside his coat. Cutter sat under watch. The riders turned their horses toward the east. The day was beginning its long work. Jonah stepped out from the shack, then stopped and looked back once. Ayanna sat in the doorway wrapped in wool and pale light, tired to the bone, still proud, still unbroken. She raised her chin the slightest bit, and that was enough. Jonah touched the brim of his hat in answer and turned toward the trail. Out in that country, justice did not always arrive fast. It did not always wear a star. Sometimes it came on a tired horse, carried by a wounded woman, protected by a man smart enough to stand still, when lying would have been easier. And sometimes the loudest thing it left behind was not a gunshot or a speech. Sometimes it was only the quiet that follows when decent people choose, at last, not to look away.